Good afternoon. I apologize that I couldn't be there in person. I really hate it that I'm missing this, but I highly doubt that your class wants somebody coughing that has a fever and chills. So hopefully Jim plays this. If not, then we'll reschedule it to another day. And please feel free to reach out to me. Jim can circulate my email. We can put it on Canvas if you ever have any questions or thoughts on the presentation. What I'm going to talk a little bit about today is project management and change management. First I'll introduce myself, and then we'll go through just some generalities of project management as well as some fun exercises, well, not really exercises, but a fun look at ineffective project managers. I think we've all had some experiences with those, and then we'll look at research for what makes a project manager effective. And then lastly, talk about the intersection between project management and change management. So feel free to stop the video throughout if there's ever any discussion. And I know what it's like to be an instructor and have to fill an hour when you had planned on it. Now, Jim's probably an exception. He can easily fill an hour, as you all well know by this point. But again, thanks, Jim, for giving me the opportunity to speak. So again, the agenda, I'll introduce myself, talk a little bit about PM and the PMBOK, which is the Project Management Book of Knowledge, which is what PMI, Project Management Institution. They certify project management professionals, which is really the gold standard for project management across the U.S. as well as internationally. Like I said, the characteristics of PM and the intersection of change management and project management. All right, first, just to introduce myself, I'm currently a strategy engagement leader, Reed internal management consultant at Humana, and I've been there for about 4 years. I'm also an adjunct professor. I'll be teaching a course, Organizational Change and Consulting, for the DBA class coming up starting in a week, and that goes through this semester. And then I'm also teaching at University of South Florida St. Pete a project management class to the undergrads there. So my background in education, engineering background at Notre Dame, MBA at UGA, and then graduated in the same cohort as Jim from the DBA just this past December. I'm also PMP certified and got my Six Sigma and Lean Black Belt from Bank of America, and I started my career at General Electric and got a green belt there, and then fundamentals of engineering. So my career spanned starting at General Electric as an engineer, design engineering, manufacturing engineering, and that was all within the appliance and lighting business. So spent between co-oping and then working there full-time for about 3 years, spent close to 4 or 5 years there, and progressed throughout my career to work into an operations management role, managing a assembly line of dishwashers with 100 direct reports. Went back to get my MBA, and then I started as an internal consultant at Bank of America. There we used Six Sigma, Lean methodology, as well as project management to act as an internal consulting group with that lens and expertise. So at Bank of America, I worked across investment banking, retail banking, and commercial banking. Just whatever project, 6 month or 1 year, had come up and the enterprise needed support on. I was then recruited to SSA & Company, which is a small consulting firm out of New York, and working with large Fortune 500 clientele. Worked on 4 different engagements there, and we'll hit on some of those in this talk. And then lastly, currently with Humana, and started out as a lead of continuous improvement and now strategy engagement leader. So all throughout my career, there's been some consistency, and that is, I didn't write on here, but process improvement and project management as well as change management. At GE, Bank of America, SSA, and Humana, I acted more as a consultant and came in and worked a project from start to finish. And I started my career with no project management training, got some at Bank of America, and then got certified while I was there as well. But it's been consistent throughout, and with project management, a key component is change management. Oftentimes it's missing in the planning as well as the execution phase. So we'll hit on that a little bit towards the end of the talk here. So a little bit around the project. So I did lead a large portfolio at Bank of America and a large ERP implementation project at SSA for a $4 billion utility company. And if anybody out there has been a part of an ERP implementation, you know the struggles and the issues that you go through in implementing something like Oracle ERP. And then utilize the DMAIC Six Sigma methodology, specifically at GE and Bank of America, and then we've taken a twist of that at Humana. And then lastly, advised a project management team for a new product launch at $11 billion retail company in Florida. And we built a team from scratch that reduced the overall time to market for new products released online as well in stores. So that's a little bit about my background in project management. And again, change management throughout all of those, but we'll talk about the intersection or lack of intersection. So the goal is give you a little bit of exposure to the PMBOK as well as some PMP fundamentals. Talk about real practitioner view of project management, which, Jim or whoever's moderating this, feel free to pause and ask, because I'm sure you all have experiences with both good and bad versions of what we'll talk about today. And then talk lastly about why it's so difficult to merge change management and project management. Okay, so first, let's talk about project management in general. And really around the need for project management. So I looked up some estimations between 2016 and 2020. They estimate that 4.7 million jobs will be open over that time period in project management. So there's no shortage of need, and this was when I started teaching the undergrads. I pulled some articles from the Wall Street Journal back in late November, early December, and there's no shortage of opportunities where project management and effective project management can assist. So Tesla is opening up a China plant, and I think it's scheduled for 2020. The intent is to take advantage of a 25% tariff that they currently have on automobiles that are imported there, as well as take advantage of one of the largest growing electric markets in the world. So building a new plant obviously takes a significant amount of cross-functional decision making and requires project management. GM is getting into electric vehicles as well as other manufacturing, and specifically looking at driverless cars. There's a huge opportunity for project management there. We talked about ERP briefly. Oracle is implementing an ERP with Caesars. And some of the numbers there, 47 casinos, 34,000 hotel rooms across 5 different countries, and they're still on green screens. They've been using that for the last 30 years. So ERP is one of the largest needs for effective project management. We all know Amazon bought Whole Foods. Think about all the things that go on behind the scenes. The pricing integration, the system integration, simple things like the signage. That takes a significant amount of time as well as coordination. And you bet there's project managers that are working on that still today, and to ramp that up as quickly as possible. So on the negative side, my wife has family that's down in Puerto Rico, and they just recently got power back on, I think, 3-4 weeks ago. And man, that was a mess with the contracting with Whitefish, and there were some balls dropped early on in the planning for project management. But that's an example of crisis project management and the need for immediate change. And then if you're an NFL fan, we have a big game on Sunday. The Raiders are planning a $2 billion, 65,000 seat new stadium in Las Vegas. They broke ground back in November and have very specific timetables to get that stadium up and running for the 2020 season. So the timeline, as well as a $2 billion budget, you bet there's project managers that are trying not to go over there. Now those are some very prominent examples, if you will, in the Wall Street Journal, and I'm sure everybody sitting in the room today has worked as a project manager or utilized project management skills or managed a project manager or been a part of a project where a project manager was assisting and driving the project. Doesn't have to be a huge project like the ones that are listed here. I've worked on many 3-month engagements, 3-month projects or less, and then I've also worked on 1 year, 2 year, 3 year. The ERP implementation with Accenture was multi-year. So project management is there's a huge need out there, and there continues to be growth within Project Management Institute and certifying project management professionals. Currently, 773 certified PMPs. I think that was as of 2016 when I saw that date. So it's essentially doubled since 2008. So what's going on? There's a Standish report. This comes from, they call it the Chaos Report. It's come from the Standish group. So if you ever looked up project management failure on Google or in any academic setting, you'll probably come across this report, and it's been repeated up until 2015, which is the most recent one. I don't have it on here, but it's not much different. So you look at the successful rate, it's hovering above, just below, and the last one was 29%. Challenge, the definition there was that it was completed, but it was over budget, over time, and or it didn't work as expected. And then failed, it just never got off the ground. At some point or another, it was killed and never delivered or never used. So more than 70% of projects are considered failure, and only 30% or less considered success. Now, if we've got more and more project managers, what's going on? Why aren't we seeing this successful tick up? And by the way, this is based on a survey of IT executives. I think it was over 300 or so IT executives. Okay, so let's go over the definition of a project. One-time, complex process, one time being key, has a very clear start and a very clear finish, limited by constraining resources, so budget, schedule, people, money, capital. It's there to resolve a very clear goal or set of goals, and then it's customer focused. So I came up with the triple constraint, and I think you may have seen the first slide. I didn't go over it, but it's the old you pick any two of the triple constraint: the budget, timing, and the quality. Now, since then, research has added a fourth one. So now you've got the budget, schedule, performance, and client acceptance. So think about performance as, does it meet the specs that we laid out in the contract? And then client acceptance is, just like it said, does the client accept and does it meet their specifications, not just the performance specifications? So the PMBOK, which is now on its 6th edition, the 5th edition definition was the temporary endeavor undertaken to create a unique product, service, or result. Now I'll take a moment to say why that definition is important. I teach the undergrads the difference between a project and a process. And the importance to knowing the difference is you're going to manage a project differently than you're going to manage a process. For a project, because it's one time, you've probably never done it before, it's unique, you're going to try to bring in the best subject matter experts and substitute them in and out on the project, especially if it's a long lead time, long schedule. For a process, that's something that you're repeating over and over again. So your management style on a project is going to be very different for a process. Process, you're going to be hawking it. You're going to be using your statistical analysis and statistical tools to see, is this repeatable? Am I reducing variation? With a project, you got one shot, and you got to get it right. So you're going to be flexible, innovative on what decisions you make. With a process, you're going to be willing to train an individual. Project, probably not as much. Again, you're going to want to get the best of the best and get them to drive you across the goal line. Okay, so the PMI framework, it lays out 5 different process groups. So if you look at the bottom chart there, the initiate, plan, execute, monitor, control, and close, that's really the core of PMI. Underneath that, let me flip to the next slide here, it gets pretty complicated quickly. You've got knowledge areas as well as process activities. So you've got 42 process activities that fit into those different knowledge areas that all fit into the different process groups. So that's the way that PMI is structured, and actually in PMBOK 6, I think they've added a handful of process activities. So you've got the groups below, and the way that it's structured in the PMBOK itself is for each activity, you've got inputs and you've got outputs. So, for example, So for example, if I was to look at the activity of determine the budget, some of the inputs to that is going to be cost estimates, work breakdown structure, and the scope baseline, an overall schedule, a project team, and procurement contracts are all going to be important inputs to determine what the budget is. A key output is going to be in the planning documents and the overall project management plans, and then the ability to then control those costs moving forward and track those. So that's an example of how the PMBOK is structured and the thought process behind that. If anybody has a PMP or is considering a PMP, it's important to memorize and to get to know all the process areas. Okay, so I hit on this, and I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but this will be the way that you study for the PMI framework and the exam, and this is the way that project PMPs are trained. Now, what happens in real life, in practitioner land, if you will, and where all of you work in your industry? I'd be interested to hear what your project management frameworks look like. I'm going to share 4 of them, the first being the PMI process steps and process areas. So the initiate, plan, execute. Monitor, control really goes across all of them, and then close or terminate. Now, you'll probably have different versions of this, but something very similar at a lot of organizations. Then you have an IT software development lifecycle, most commonly known as waterfall approach, and it's typically applied to information technology projects. So a good example would be the ERP implementation we went through. We went through these steps, and when you get to testing in particular, there's multiple versions of testing. There's going to be integration testing, there's going to be user acceptance testing, 4 or 5 different categories within that. So this is what it looks like, and they're typically all planned out at the very beginning, start to finish. As we all know, the plans never work as anticipated. So what do you do when you have a rigid project plan in place and a project management team or a PMO team who's unwilling to flex? It becomes difficult very quick. Another one is Lean Six Sigma. So at GE and Bank of America, they would really fit all projects into this define, measure, analyze, improve, control framework. And it didn't always make sense for some projects, but they managed to get it to work. GE at the time in the late 90s and early 2000s was pushing Six Sigma very hard, as well as Bank of America. But I'd say at GE it was truly part of the culture, and that's how they managed the milestones for any projects that came up. Now there's a newer methodology known as Agile, or you may have heard Scrum. It started, I'm going to say 2010-ish is when it started to really come about more and more, and again, more focus on IT projects to try to solve that issue that I mentioned before of a very rigid project structure in place. And the way that you can think about Agile is through short sprints. So instead of going through the whole planning cycle that you see above in the waterfall chart, they may have 3 or 4 planning sprints where they last 1 to 4 weeks. And there's a lot of different tools and a lot of different meeting structures and team structures that Agile takes advantage of. And the whole goal is to try to incorporate customer requirements throughout, earlier in the process, and get the customer feedback earlier rather than going through the full waterfall and having the customer come in towards the end and say, no, this doesn't work, we want something else. So the advantage of the Agile is that it starts to incorporate that customer feedback. There's some difficulties there as well. You've got very specialized individuals on teams that have to work on these Agile sprints so they won't get exposure to some other projects. And there's some literature out there on both the advantages and disadvantages. So I'm not a proponent for just blindly implementing Agile. I think there's specific project characteristics and probably specific industries where it would make sense to adopt Agile. Okay, so that's some of the frameworks. Now let's talk a little bit about, I kind of had fun with this, the characteristics of project managers, some that are ineffective and some that were effective. And this is by no means based off of research. This is more just my experience. So please pause the video and laugh or say you're completely wrong, or say I've got experience with that type of project manager. The first one is the micromanager. So have you ever been endlessly followed up with by a project manager? And I mean endlessly. So I've got experience where I'll get an email right after a project meeting. Do you have this? My name is, in line with an owner of a specific activity, so that project manager is going to keep hounding me till that activity is completed. Emails, phone calls, meetings, over and over and over again, even after building the trust with this project manager. So some of the characteristics, they need to know every detail. That's not a bad thing as a project manager, but it can be a bad thing because there are times when there's just too much going on and a project manager doesn't need to get into the specific detail. Now you can argue vice versa. There are times when project manager needs to get into the details to understand where there's an issue and elevate that to management. But truly trusting your subject matter expertise as a PM is important. Endlessly follow up, and let's just say it's very annoying. We've all had those PMs or team members that just continue to follow up over and over again. So in my opinion, what are some of those drivers? Maybe need for involvement. Most likely there's some distrust back and forth, and the project manager wants to make sure that the work's going to get done. I can't blame him for that, but after some time you want to build that trust up. And then difficulty seeing the big picture. So some of these ineffective micromanager PMs that I've seen have difficulty seeing the system. And I know Jim has probably talked multiple times about systems theory in the class. Not everybody gets that, and there's a significant amount of individuals that don't. So a second type that I consistently see is I'll call him the method manager, project manager. I'm going to follow this PMI methodology no matter what anybody tells me, no matter what the project looks like. We got to do this tool, we got to do activity 43 followed by 44. And in Six Sigma, we see that too. If you've ever had experience with a black belt or a master black belt, I've got to follow and do all the tools in the define phase, no matter what, if it slows us down. I'd argue that sometimes that makes sense to slow the project down. A lot of times it doesn't, and you got to be flexible. So some of the characteristics, rigorously enforcing the methodology. So automated decision making. I've got this process I'm going to follow, and I'm going to follow it all the way through. We mentioned this. You don't have to use every tool, every methodology on every project. Sometimes garden shears are going to work instead of a chainsaw. And you hear over and over again, when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And it's truly the case here with some PMs that I see, especially transitioning from an IT project management role to something outside of IT. IT, there's a little bit more need for that rigor and that structure. Drivers may be inexperience or just fear of change. Lack of experience is another one. Lack of judgment is another one. They may just be afraid to make a decision themselves. And then lastly, inflexibility. I don't know how many projects I've been a part of that probably everyone didn't end the way that we planned on starting it. And I'm sure everybody in the room can agree. Very rarely does it happen where everything goes to plan. Alright, the next one is kind of fun here. The bull and the China shop project manager. They're going to drive to that deliverable, that work breakdown structure, and that plan, no matter what it costs. And they see resources as just exactly what I said, resources. And you'll see this individual and this type of project manager oftentimes upsetting most of the project team to the point where some of the relationships may not be repairable. There's nothing wrong with holding strong to the plan at times, but again, projects don't always go as planned, and flexibility is extremely important. And then another characteristic that I've seen is the thought process that they can overcome just about any obstacle. And they think they can substitute for the subject matter expert when the subject matter expert may not be pulling their weight, or may be busy and pulled on to some other project or some save the business and run the business issue. Drivers of that, overconfidence and arrogance that they can do all, and there's oftentimes a lack of emotional intelligence, a lack of self-awareness and the ability to put themselves in the other person's shoes. The old negotiation tactic of with them, what's in it for me? Some people just struggle with that lack of self-awareness and awareness of situation and emotional intelligence. All right, so now flip to the other side of things, and there's some individuals, I love The Office, Michael Scott, so it's my philosophy, something that I live by and I'll always have and always will. Don't ever, for any reason, do anything to anyone, ever for any reason. We've all been a part of projects where the PM is considered what I call a pleaser. They don't want to upset anybody, and they'll bend for one stakeholder and then maybe bend for another, and all of a sudden you're bending both ways and you've got a larger issue. So characteristics, typically just afraid of conflict. They don't want to upset anybody, and they will bow to stakeholder pressure. Change control, what's that? If you've ever been a part of a project that lacks any formal change control, especially large projects, extremely difficult because stakeholders throughout are going to be asking for different things. Customers are going to be asking for different things. And it doesn't always make sense to make those changes in the overall scope of the project. Desire to be liked, maybe inexperienced, insecure of the self or their position. All those could be potential drivers of what I'll call the pleaser PM. And then lastly, and you can probably come up with more of these on your own, and I'd be interested, and I wish I was there to discuss, what I'll call the stay in your lane PM. And this PM is just going to do project management duties. They are not going to go out of their way to pick up the team when somebody else drops the ball or needs assistance and needs help. They're typically going to say, that is Jim's fault. He was the one that was supposed to do that, and I'm going to call him out in the executive meetings and the quarterly reports and mark it down in my project plan. They'll also expect that everybody else stays in their lane. The cross-functional teamwork is typically without existence when you have a PM in charge of this type. So yeah, it's not my problem. It's his or her fault, and I'm going to be constantly, as a swim lane PM, pointing out where the faults are and where the issues are. Again, it's lack of awareness of the systems and the overall upstream and downstream impacts of the project or the work that they're doing specific to the project. And it could be a lack of a business acumen. Alright, so any other project management types? Do these ring true to you? It was fun putting this together and kind of thinking through some of my past experiences with PMs. So what does research say? And you'll have these slides. I know it's kind of an eye chart, but they're very consistent when you look at some of the studies that are here. Communication skills, influencing skills, tolerance for ambiguity, flexible management, creative decision making, cooperative leadership, integrative thinking. All of those things are people skills. And I teach my undergrads that because we can easily teach the technical skills. And don't get me wrong, you have to have a set of technical skills to be an effective project manager. You've got to be able to set a budget. You've got to be able to know how to put together a statement of work or a project charter. You've got to know how to manage to a timeline. All those are technical skills, and they are necessary. But as I look through this research, there's not very many that have to do with technical skills. Maybe experience, maybe credibility somewhat, but the majority are the people side of things. And that's where change management comes into play. So a project manager has to be effective really in two areas, because a project is going to have those technical skill needs as well as the people skill needs. And it does come with experience. So it's extremely difficult to teach this to my undergrad course. I just continue to hammer it into them that projects aren't necessarily hard because of the technical skills always. There's complications, but it's the people. that caused the biggest issue. That's where change management comes into play. So project management is defined as the application of knowledge, skills, tools, and techniques to project activities to meet the project requirements. Change management, a little bit different, and I pulled a version of Cotter's change and steps to change. So I'm not going to go through the definition because you guys have seen on Canvas multiple different versions of change management, approaches to change management. But the point here is they really should come together. It shouldn't be one without the other. When you've got a project management plan, it needs to integrate change management. So ideally, they're one and the same. My experience, they usually aren't. We've had some, I'd say, positive experience at Bank of America. There was an internal consulting group known as the Change Adoption Group. They started to build their own playbook for change management and change adoption and integrated into some of the project management fundamentals on the overall Bank of America PMO. Now, there was a lot of resistance to that. And at the beginning, as change adoption began to grow, they were seen simply as a communication team, maybe doing an occasional stakeholder analysis. But it started to get some trust and credibility, and they saw some quick wins and eventually some longer term wins, and began to become part of the overall project management office. And project managers gain some of that skill set through training and through practice and experience of change management. Now you guys can pause and just talk through this. What other tools or what other ways have you seen change management integrated into project management? Humana, we've got a similar situation where they're trying to build a change management team. Now there's only 2 FTEs that are leading our change management department. 2 out of 50,000 internal associates and an additional 30,000 vendors at Humana. So good luck. It's tough sledding there. But they're integrating with our internal consulting group, and we're trying to take some of what their training and what they're going through and build that into project management throughout the project. So I want to end on a story. And this comes from a project that I referenced multiple times because it was just such a clear indication of where change management was missing on a huge project. So that's the Oracle ERP implementation. And my consulting firm was brought in. So the situation was water utility company implementing brand new ERP system, Oracle, using currently the old green screens, basically on all types of systems, accounting or manufacturing, payroll systems. They were looking at doing this all in a big bang. And you may have had cases on what happens when you try a big bang implementation. Regardless, Accenture was the system integrator and working closely with Oracle to implement this at the client site. For some reason, they chose to go with another system that you may be familiar with called Kronos, which was their timekeeping and payroll system. It did not seamlessly integrate with Oracle. So Accenture didn't have that in their contract. The project management managed that. We had a previous relationship with the client, and they trusted us and saw that payroll is one of the most important aspects of the ERP implementation. That's where everybody gets paid. And if you want to upset anybody, delay their paycheck and tell them that the ERP system is the issue here. Wouldn't go over too well. So our firm was brought in to do 2 things. One is be the integrator for Kronos into Oracle, and then 2, take the legacy system, which was JD Edwards, and make sure that that could go into Oracle too. We call it the backup plan. So we were simultaneously managing 2 different projects. So it was a great experience for me. We ended up going with the legacy and integrating that into Oracle, but it didn't slow down the project, so it saved the client millions of dollars in additional cost. Now they had to go wait 6 months before they were actually going to implement Kronos. But there was a couple things that I walked away with. And we had one of the best consultants who had implemented ERP systems at other water companies across the U.S. He's been through 5 or 6 at water companies, so he's seen this over and over again. And I remember him telling me over and over again, we're going to build the ship. Ship's going to be built, but the crew's not going to be ready. There is no way the crew's going to be ready. So what happens in the projects, you've probably seen this, change management is in the project plan. There's training incorporated, there's communication incorporated in the project plan, but when the rubber hits the road and that plan starts to condense and you get less and less time and some activities expand and take longer than anticipated, what's the first thing that goes? Training, communication. It's so easy to say, we'll get that later. Not a big deal. Well, in this case, it was a pretty big deal. If you're going to implement an ERP system across the entire organization, they better be ready on day one to use it. I wasn't a part of day one. We had since left the project, but you can imagine the difficulty. There was training, but it wasn't enough. And there was plans to have the super users involved early in the project and start to pull individuals across the organization to act as those super users. But that got nixed and that got pushed back. So I'll never forget that, and that one stuck with me. And hopefully, if anything else, that one sticks with you too. Is you got to have the crew ready when you're building the ship in a project. It's extremely important, and that's the value that I truly see in the integration of change management and project management. So thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak. Again, I'm extremely sorry, but I'm sure you don't want me coughing in your direction with potentially the flu. So I hope to hear from you, and let me know if you have any questions. Thanks, everybody.